This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. It can stand on its own, but I would recommend listening to my episode on the New Right before tackling this one. This is Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, Part 2. Paul Weyrich was on a mission. Weyrich was a founding member of the New Right, a small group of men who coordinated efforts to push extremist conservative views. If you'll remember, they mastered direct mailing, lobbying for their kind of candidates, and used money to shape Washington in their image. A reporter once described Weyrich like this.
His mien is that of a formal, slightly constipated owl. He speaks in the clipped phrases of a man in a hurry.
He already had a lot of plates spinning. On the ground floor of the Heritage Foundation, which represented the domestic terrorists in the Kanawha County textbook war, founder of the National Christian Action Coalition. He courted the Christian Voice organization. His goal now, to try to get Christians to back New Right agendas. What he and his cohorts needed was a figurehead, someone charismatic and already established. They saw this subset of American life, religious conservatives, and wanted to court them. These guys were not in the religious mainstream. Some of them were followers of R.J. Rushdoony's Christian Reconstruction, with a mishmash of other backgrounds. Take Paul Weyrich, for example. I've seen video of Weyrich, and while he made the rounds at events and was gifted at political maneuverings, he was not charming. Good at riling people up, but not a figurehead. Nobody wants a constipated owl leading their church or hanging out at their barbecue. Jerry Falwell was everything the New Right needed. Folksy, a broadcaster with an existing audience, and a practiced public speaker. Someone they wouldn't have to platform because he already had one. In the last episode, we looked at Jerry Falwell's early life, how he built his church, media empire, and schools, his problematic past with racism, how he showed up at national culture war events like a fundamentalist whack-a-mole. Today, we're going to explore why he was chosen, among all the known quantities of the day, as the face of the moral majority. And we're going to ask the question, was the moral majority really a majority? Or what you get when you partner with a known, let's say it nicely, a known exaggerator? You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Starrin, and this is Truth.
Any shrewd political strategist, when he sees a bunch of organizations that act under the discipline of a single charismatic leader and have, roughly speaking, an ideological agreement with what that political activist wants, they're going to try and recruit them to their side.
This is Rick Perlstein, author of Reaganland and The Invisible Bridge.
So if you're conservative and you look at an organization called a church, right? And if you look at a fundamentalist or an evangelical church, as basically has a conservative orientation towards issues that might not necessarily be seen as important parts of public policy, but we're becoming more and more so as the 60s become the 1970s. You are going to basically go hunting where the ducks are. And this was tried kind of again and again through the 60s and 70s. How can we recruit preachers almost to act like precinct captains? By 1976, the same people who were kind of the core organizing cadre of the New Right, Richard Viguerie, Howard Phillips, Paul Weyrich, are getting together with a figure who's completely forgotten in these discussions, but was very prominent at the time, named John Conlon, a former congressman who was a politicized fundamentalist. And they get together and come up with a bunch of kind of training materials and books and come up with kind of a precinct strategy to try and recruit fundamentalist ministers to elect more Republicans. And this is the same year that, of course, the Democratic candidate was famously a born-again evangelical, Jimmy Carter.
A born-again Christian. You'd think he was custom-made for folks like Falwell, right?
But this is a born-again whose favorite philosopher was Reinhold Niebuhr.
Niebuhr was a socialist, something fundamentalists wouldn't have liked.
and supported gay rights,
even hiring openly gay people in his administration.
and was not aligned with the rest of his Southern Baptists on these kinds of issues. And Gerald Ford, as I narrate in the book in one of the early chapters, tries to kind of steal his evangelical constituency by palling around with the former head of the Southern Baptist Convention, Wally Criswell, appearing in his church and winning his endorsement. The same guy who said, John F. Kennedy is going to turn America into an adjunct of the Vatican.
Criswell, as you may remember, featured heavily in my episode about the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. Here he is, a public religious figure, palling around with President Ford.
This is a guy in Texas who would have been voting Democrat all his life, but 1976 changes his allegiance to the Republicans. Now, this attempt to organize fundamentalists and right-wing evangelicals for the Republican Party in 1976 ends up backfiring.
When their plans were exposed in print, Gerald Ford's efforts felt unseemly to the public. The separatist movement, where Jerry Falwell started, was alive and well in the 70s and would have guffawed at such a blatant desire to merge the worldly with the holy.
They might divide their congregation, right? They might violate the biblical injunction that you're supposed to, train your eyes on things above and not things of this world, that they would be accused of being worldly, right? And we all know the stories about, fundamentalists in places like, West Virginia and South Carolina who wouldn't even vote because it was seen as too worldly. So what they did was they hired a pollster. They did two things with this poll. They asked rank and file parishioners whether they would support their minister if he got involved in political campaigns. And then they asked what kind of issues they might be interested in. And this pollster, his name was Lance Terrence, came back and said, not only would they be willing to support a preacher who did this, they're desperate for their preachers to do it. And this was probably the result, kind of like a inflection point of, by 1978, 1979, of all these issues, the Equal Rights Amendment, gay rights, questions about abortion, coming to a head in the public mind as political issues, as issues that could be affected by who you vote for in the voting booth, which, certainly, wasn't the case before the late 1970s, right? No one said, I'm not going to vote for Lyndon Johnson because it was a position on abortion, because abortion really wasn't on the menu as a political issue. Once this pollster tells them that, they're off to the races.
The New Right wanted to try again, like Spiritual Mobilization and others before them, to get religious people to vote as a bloc. But why Jerry Falwell? Here's author and historian Daniel K. Williams.
Paul Weyrich believed that the New Right needed to reach out to conservative evangelicals. He believed that if the New Right was going to succeed, their success would come not only from working class Catholics, where he thought he and Richard Viguerie might have some influence, having come from working class Catholic roots themselves, but they really needed to appeal to evangelicals in the Sun Belt. And neither Viguerie nor Weyrich nor anyone who was currently working in their small staff really had significant connections to Southern evangelicals. They believed that if they had an evangelical pastor, that they would be able to make inroads into that constituency.
They needed a consultant of sorts to go fishing for the right candidate.
They knew Ed McAteer. Ed McAteer was someone who was a Southern Baptist layman, someone who was actually a sales representative for the Colgate toothpaste company, but he was someone who was very involved in his church, which was quickly becoming the largest Southern Baptist congregation of the time. It was in Memphis. It was Bellevue Baptist. But he had connections outside of the Southern Baptist Convention as well, and he knew Falwell, and he was sympathetic to what Weyrich and Viguerie were trying to do. He believed in this effort to try to reclaim the country for conservative, religiously based principles, and he suggested bringing Falwell on board, which Weyrich and his allies were very happy to do.
Falwell was an understandable choice for all the reasons we've already covered. Even before the moral majority, he'd built his national platform, hosting I Love America rallies, preaching, speaking. He was everywhere.
Falwell had this national television and radio audience. that he claimed had 25 million weekly viewers. The actual fact was it's probably about 1.5 million. So there's considerable exaggeration there, which is not surprising with Falwell. There was definitely a lot of hyperbole, but 1.5 million is a large audience. And beyond that, he had already participated in political campaigns on behalf of the rights of Christian schools. So he was well connected to the entire network of Christian school administrators across the United States. And by 1979, there were 5,000 Christian schools in existence, and new ones were being formed at the rate of about 2 per day. So it was a rapidly growing movement. And so Falwell was very well connected to that movement.
He had influence in his denomination. He ran schools and one of the largest churches in the country, not to mention his concern for moral issues.
Although the term wasn't used at the time, I think in today's context, we would be very comfortable calling that Christian nationalism. That is, this belief that the country was founded on Christian principles, that the country had lost those Christian principles, and that the only way to save the country from destruction would be to rediscover the religious basis for the nation's laws and to create laws that would honor that connection, including a restoration of prayer in the public school classroom, a national law against abortion, restrictions on the emerging gay rights movement. All of those things were part of that package, as well as a stronger defense against international communism, an arms buildup program to reclaim America's place in the world as this beacon of anti-communism. All of those things were part of Falwell's political agenda. And when he was tapped by Weyrich and Viggory and their associates to launch this political movement with this new organization that they decided would be called the Moral Majority, that was something that was very appealing to Falwell because it allowed him to tie together a lot of the causes that he was already working on, but to do so under one unified platform, one umbrella.
Just starting an organization doesn't mean much. People start them all the time, but the Moral Majority was coordinated by the New Right. So it wasn't just one org, but several working together.
There's the Moral Majority PAC, which would raise money for conservative political candidates that would align with the Moral Majority's issue-based platform. So they had a set of political principles, and then they would rate congressional candidates on their support for particular pieces of legislation that would line up with those principles. And so the Moral Majority PAC would provide money to them.
Like the New Right, they had cash on hand to finance their kind of candidates. There was also Moral Majority Inc., a legislative body, the Moral Majority Foundation, which was an educational group, and later, they bundled in a legal defense fund. A number of celebrity pastors signed on, including Pat Robertson, D. James Kennedy, James Robeson, Tim LaHaye, and Charles Stanley. It wasn't just any old centrally controlled organization. According to historian Francis Fitzgerald, pastors were encouraged to form state chapters to elect local candidates and push initiatives and to preach from the pulpit on political topics. They did all of that, but their main goal might come as a surprise.
Perhaps more importantly, it was a voter registration organization. While Falwell claimed he registered 4 million new voters in 1980, the truth is it was probably closer to 2 million, but 2 million is still significant. And so the Moral Majority representatives would go into churches, often using church directories or a table set up outside of a church sanctuary, and register new people to vote on Sunday morning.
Sure, but they'd screen out Democrats, right? Nope.
They would register people to vote no matter what party they might want to join, but the overwhelming majority of those people, it seems, I think no one disputes this, were Republicans who planned to vote for Ronald Reagan. Falwell believed, Viggory and Weyrich certainly believed this as well, that evangelicals were the sleeping giant of politics, that they should have been more influential than they were, but the problem was that they were voting in lower numbers. It's unclear that they actually were as politically disengaged as what people have often said, but that was the line that was not only Falwell and Weyrich's line, that was the line that the media itself was giving.
Sure. But while they voted for Carter and Ford in similar numbers, it was Reagan who really got evangelicals to vote Republican, right?
Evangelicals did not support Ronald Reagan in the same numbers that they had, or by the same percentages that they had supported Richard Nixon.
We as a people have come to the GOP before. So why didn't I end the season with Nixon and go on with my life?
What was new was that there was now a more overt connection between faith and politics than there had been in 1972. So in 1972, there had been this general culture of evangelical voting for Nixon, but there had not been any organizations with the same national recognition of the moral majority leading that effort.
They had a figurehead and were better organized through a constellation of organizations, not just the moral majority. And weirdly, as Daniel said, their political oomph wasn't as strong with Reagan as it had been with Nixon. But there were differences between the two eras.
In 1980, by contrast, you had pastors who were very comfortable talking about some of this directly from the pulpit, particularly when it concerned abortion or gay rights, what they would have considered moral issues that were perfectly appropriate to talk about in church. And you had churches that were actually giving space to voter registration efforts that were happening just outside of the sanctuary. That type of thing was new in 1980. So I think in 1980, many people who were in this conservative evangelical subculture were seeing for the first time an overt connection between faith and partisanship that perhaps had not existed in the same way in previous elections. And there was now an overt exhortation to register to vote because the survival of the country, many conservative evangelicals said, was on the line.
These religious groups were clearly interested in having their voices heard by people in power. And really, that's not unusual. Every subculture wants a seat at the table, wants the country to reflect their values, and see themselves represented appropriately in the media. So when it comes to the 1980 Religious Roundtable, a bunch of religious groups were represented, and candidate Reagan spoke there making his case for why they should vote for him, while Carter was notably absent. This is when Reagan delivered this now classic line. "I know that this is a nonpartisan gathering, and so I know that you can't endorse me, but I only brought that up because I want you to know that I endorse you and what you're doing."
By later standards, it wasn't particularly large. There were a few thousand people there. Mostly they were leaders, pastors of large churches, not so much people from the grassroots taking buses across the country to attend this event. Reagan also spoke at Falwell's institution, Liberty Baptist College, of course, now Liberty University.
Reagan also made speeches at Bob Jones University and the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, but large gatherings were not the heart of the moral majority's influence.
The real channels of the influence came through existing networks. So, as I mentioned, Falwell had this television show that was nationally broadcast and this radio show as well. So Christian radio stations, which was a rapidly growing emerging market, along with televangelism, and this was really the height of the televangelist's influence in 1980, not only with Falwell, but also with Pat Robertson and his 700 Club and other televangelists as well.
They wrangled technology to spread their messaging. Christian media was critical in this moment.
There were also books that were published that were widely available in Christian bookstores, like Tim LaHaye's Battle for the Mind, which came out in 1980, which was very overtly political and talked about the secular humanist conspiracy with a list of specific steps that people could take to become politically active and a checklist for how people should evaluate their congressional representative or political party on the specific issues that the moral majority cared about.
Another book of note was Jerry Falwell's Listen, America! Excuse me. Listen, America. You kind of have to yell the name because there's an exclamation point at the end of it. My copy was published by Bantam Books, the same organization that released The Late Great Planet Earth. In it, Falwell connects many of the issues we've covered this season. Here's something from page 78.
It is time Americans realize the severe attack currently being waged in America against our families. This nation's foundation is its homes. Karl Marx described the hallowed correlation of parents and child as disgusting.
The old chestnut that communists are coming for your family, which, yes, was a real threat on the other side of the world as communists persecuted religious people. Not so likely here in the States. But in 1980, it was an established drum to beat whenever you wanted to scare people. Further down the page, he wrote,
When the communists established their rules for bringing about revolution in 1919, they said this: corrupt the young, get them away from religion, get them interested in sex, make them superficial, destroy their ruggedness.
And on page 25,
our founding fathers were not all Christians, but they were guided by biblical principles. They developed a nation predicated on Holy Writ.
it sounds like Francis Schaeffer, right? That's because he was cited as a source in the book. He went on to back Milton Friedman, laissez-faire economics, to denounce the New Deal and welfare, and to call for the continued buildup of national defense. Using money to support politicians, education, books, these guys had a lot of tools at their disposal. But there were more.
But also, I think churches could be channels of some of this. Sometimes because a pastor would actually talk about an issue like abortion from the pulpit, which was done commonly in 1980 in a way that it had not necessarily been done in the recent past, that there was this new alarm over abortion, over gay rights. In fact, Falwell led the way on that in 1978 by preaching a series of 3 sermons, one on homosexuality, one on abortion, one on pornography, the 3 big issues that he wanted to fight in 1978. And other pastors might do something similar to that. It's impossible to know how many did so. It's impossible to track all of these individual sermons from 1980, but we do know that was going on. We also know that the moral majority tended to have its most successful organization among Baptist pastors in metropolitan areas of the Sun Belt. So Birmingham was a major center for that. It tended not to have as much reach in rural areas at the time. It tended to be primarily a suburban movement. And so it was very successful at mobilizing a particular constituency among evangelicals, not necessarily all evangelicals at the time, but a particular constituency.
The moral majority wasn't the only thing going. There were other organizations and charismatic leaders. Christian Voice, the Eagle Forum, the Religious Roundtable, Bill Bright's organizations, or even Francis Schaeffer's influential tapes, books, and movies.
So there were a lot of different moving parts that may have seemed somewhat disconnected on an organizational front, but because they were all part of that larger conservative ethos, sharing a similar concern, they could lead people in a similar political direction, regardless of whether or not they might have been on the moral majority mailing list.
That bears repeating because in many of the conversations I've had over the last few years while researching this topic, people hone in on the moral majority when I talk about the bonding of some evangelicals to the Republican Party. But they were not the only thing going at the time. We'll cover more of them as the season goes on. And also, we may be overstating the impact that religious people had in actually electing Ronald Reagan.
I think it's difficult to say that they won the election for him because the electoral vote was not close.
When we return, we'll look at the numbers. What impact did evangelicals really have in the 1980 election? The answer may surprise you. While you listen to the ads, why not leave a 5-star review on your podcasting app? It helps people find the show. Okay, here come the ads. Welcome back. When we discuss the 1980 election, we sometimes make it sound like evangelicals picked the president. It turns out that's not the case, because Reagan won in a landslide that could not be caused by just one niche selection of the electorate. Reagan carried 489 electoral votes, while Jimmy Carter walked away with just 49, though the popular vote was a lot closer.
It's hard to say in an election that's not close that evangelicals made the difference. If the election had been razor thin, it would be very easy to say that evangelicals made the difference, or suburban bankers in Cincinnati made the difference, or any other group made the difference, because all of those things might have been true. And when we're talking about the 2016 election, for example, it's very easy to say that nearly any factor of a small group of voters who either didn't show up or voted unexpectedly in a certain way or showed up in greater margins, made the difference for Trump. But in the 1980 election, we're not talking about that narrow margin. So I think, it's a hypothetical, but I think it's grounded in real voter analysis. I think that Reagan could have easily won had there been no moral majority.
That probably sounds surprising, given the amount of coverage this election gets when talking about the history of evangelical influence. Despite all the outreach his campaign did to evangelicals, it's possible that Reagan really didn't need their votes. While the religious right didn't pick a president, it had great influence in another area: the 1980 Republican Party platform.
The Republican Party discontinued its endorsement for the Equal Rights Amendment, which it had affirmed almost continuously from the 1940s up through 1976. The Republican Party took a strong stance against abortion. The Republican Party endorsed the right to pray in public schools. There were a number of things that the Republican Party did that were new, or at least much more forceful statements of these principles. If they had been hinted at in the platform in 1976, they were expressed much more overtly in 1980.
Falwell and others went to the Republican convention. He was invited to meet with Reagan. He said of the platform that it
could easily be the constitution of a fundamentalist Baptist church.
And so that's where I see the real influence of the moral majority. It wasn't necessarily in electing Ronald Reagan, but it was in making Ronald Reagan what he became. That is, not simply a candidate of Southwestern Sunbelt, moderately secular conservatism, or not simply a populist conservatism, but a conservatism that would be linked very firmly to some religious right principles.
The 1980 election was not the first that religious people had participated in. The moral majority was not the first or only organization of its kind. They were not the first to say that the United States was in danger of losing its faith. That had been going on since before the country was even a country. The moral majority was the marriage of a lot of cultural forces at the time. Anger about taxes, concern about the size and reach of the government, social norms changing, fear of communism, and also the strategies of the new right, using moral issues to move people in order to achieve their political goals.
It set the religious right up for continued influence in the Reagan White House, that Falwell had several visits to the Reagan White House. So did other people. So did Tim LaHaye. So did James Dobson. All of that would carry over into long-term influence in the Republican Party in ways that might not have happened in the same way had there not been cooperation between the moral majority and Republicans during the election of 1980.
And that is an important nugget. These guys wanted and received access. As we'll see, they didn't achieve 100% of their goals, but they were in the room, and that was significant. Like any niche, evangelicals wanted to be represented.
There had been this widespread perception among people like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and Tim LaHaye and others in the late 1970s that evangelicals, conservative evangelicals, had been discriminated against, that they claimed they represented 1/3 of the American electorate. That was probably exaggerated. It depends on what you mean. I think 1/3 of Americans said they were born again, but that didn't necessarily mean that 1/3 of Americans were the type of culturally conservative evangelical that Jerry Falwell or Tim LaHaye or Pat Robertson might have been. But nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that they represented at least 20% of the electorate at the time, and they correctly perceived that conservative-leaning evangelicals did not occupy 20% or 1/3 of the positions in government administration. That is, that they pointed to Jimmy Carter's cabinet and the agencies and asked the question, where were the evangelical appointments?
Where was the representation in the Carter administration? How were politicians explicitly representing us? Remember when we talked about the American South having a complex where they felt looked down upon? These evangelicals with big followings suffered from a similar fear, that they were benighted, overlooked, or oppressed, even though they claimed to be 1/3 of the population. As I said at the beginning of the season, this feeling can be a dangerous one. It can cause us to lash out and really accept whatever gets marketed to us so long as it promises to protect us. And it makes us believe in a boogeyman.
They believed that evangelicals were being ignored, that especially if you bought into the secular humanist conspiracy theory, which Tim LaHaye was its champion of, you would imagine that there was an active effort to dismantle the principles of conservative Christianity in the legal sphere, and that the people doing that were people who subscribed to secular humanist views, who wanted a fully secular society in which there would be no acknowledgement of God in public life and no use of biblical principles guiding the nation.
They figured that if they could get their kind of evangelical in power, they could change the culture. That hadn't worked with Carter, who was too nuanced for their taste. So instead of an evangelical, what about someone with passable amounts of acceptable ideas, even if they aren't saved? Like Reagan.
And that if they could achieve a number of specific legislative achievements, like rescinding Roe v. Wade or passing a constitutional amendment that would restore prayer in public schools, that a few of those major achievements would succeed in changing the moral direction of the country.
Falwell was an interesting guy, bursting with energy, master of the Jeremiad, but also an embellisher, greatly inflating the numbers on his mailing list, the viewers on his TV show, and yes, the influence of the moral majority. Falwell said that Carter's concession speech was his finest hour. But listen, Reagan won 67% of the evangelical vote, only 9 better than Ford and less than Nixon. Funny enough, he also made inroads in modernist circles and took a bite out of every Democratic subset except African Americans and Hispanics. Despite his claims, the moral majority did not actually attract Catholics, or even a wide base of conservative Protestants. More than half of the people on the moral majority's board were from Falwell's own niche denomination. 90% of members were conservative Baptist. That's hardly a strong ecumenical showing. 20 million Americans watched religious TV, where Jerry was a staple. But the moral majority, despite Falwell's bragging, only had 482,000 people on the mailing list. Fewer were actively involved. That means that, in reality, the moral majority was the minority, not just in the country, but a minority among evangelicals. We sometimes talk about the 1980 race as if it was decided by evangelicals. It wasn't. It did coalesce together a lot of elements we're still dealing with today, and that do impact elections. Politicians since Constantine have been paying homage to Christianity. Yet, in the US, we set ourselves up as something different. Not like we were in the early 1900s when Christians were the people of food purity laws and social change. Instead, we adjusted our brand to the people against stuff. We longed for a bygone era and railed against the present. And while we found influence, the country became less moral, not more.
And they thought that if they had that seat at the table, if they could elect the right candidates, those candidates could deliver political change, which would then lead to a cultural change. And they did succeed in electing a number of candidates that they wanted. They did succeed in changing the party. They never achieved the cultural change on the magnitude that they really hoped they could.
Special thanks to Daniel K. Williams. His book, God's Own Party, is the most readable of the resources on this topic that I've picked up this season and is well worth a purchase. We also heard from Rick Perlstein, author of Reaganland and The Invisible Bridge. I'm indebted to Francis Fitzgerald's books, The Evangelicals and Cities on a Hill. You can find a list of my other sources like Listen America in your show notes and on the website at trucepodcast.com. While you're there, why not give a little bit to help me make this show? I can take credit cards, Venmo, PayPal, check. There are so many ways to help. trucepodcast.com/donate. This show is just me, and I'm covering stuff that nobody else is covering. If you like what you hear and want to hear more of it, visit trucepodcast.com/donate. God willing, in a future episode, we'll talk about the later years of Falwell's life and the end of the moral majority. Involves a water slide. Subscribe to the show in your podcasting app so you get every new episode as it's released. Thanks to my friends who gave me their voices for this episode, including Morin Fry and Marcus Watson of the Spiritual Life and Leadership podcast. Truce is a production of Truce Media LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce.